Okay, let's open our Bibles. Let's go to Hosea chapter 4. And today will be part 2 of a two-part series where today we will study the remaining verses in Hosea chapter 4. Today we'll focus on verses 11 through 19. Hosea chapter 4, let me read our text, and then let's together dig into our text. Starting in verse 11, we read, "Harlotry, wine and new wine, take away the understanding. My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them. For a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God. They offer sacrifices on the tops of the mountains, and burn incense on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, or your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots, and offer sacrifices with temple prostitutes. So the people without understanding are ruined. Though you, Israel, play the harlot, do not let Judah become guilty. Also, do not go to Gilgal or go up to Beth Aven and take the oath as the Lord lives. Since Israel is stubborn like a stubborn heifer, can the Lord now pasture them like a lamb in a large field? Ephraim is joined to idols. Let them alone. Their liquor gone. They play the harlot continually. Their rulers dearly love shame. The wind wraps them in its wings, and they will be ashamed because of their sacrifices." This is God's holy, inspired, authoritative word of truth. And all of God's people say, amen. Okay, again, as you can see, today will be part 2 of a series we began last time, here in chapter 4, where we see that the Lord has a case, a covenant lawsuit. Against whom? The inhabitants of the land. Last time we saw some of the parts of this case that the Lord had against Israel. And if you recall, we saw that the Lord, in his case against them, talked about how they had committed constantly sins of omission, where they omitted or failed to do that which God clearly commanded them to do. They were not devoted to the Lord. They did not love the Lord with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. They were not loyal to the Lord. They committed sins of omission. They failed to do, they omitted to do that which God clearly commanded them. But there was more. In that case against them, the Lord also described some of their sins of commission. Doing those things which God clearly commanded them not to do. Like murder, false oaths and vows, lies and deceit. In the Lord's case against Israel, and by the way, as we saw last time, God describes who the case was against. The people in general, the false prophets, and the idolatrous priests. They were committing sins of omission. They were committing sins of commission. The priests were not instructing the people when it came to the word of the Lord. Most of the prophets were false, lying prophets, just speaking that which they came out of their dreams. And the people were lost. And if you recall, over in verse 6, God said, "My people are destroyed." Why? For lack of knowledge. They were involved in all kinds of religiosity. We're going to see some examples of that today. So they were worshiping. They were offering sacrifices, but not to Yahweh. Rather, they were going to the popular places, where the pagans held their idolatrous worship services. And today we're going to see the Lord's case get into some more details, specifically about those things Israel was doing alongside of the pagans. Again, last time in part 1 of our series, God starts out this case describing both the sins of omission and sins of commission that the inhabitants of the land were committing against Yahweh. God also described who was at fault. It wasn't just the people. It was also the lying prophets and the idolatrous priests. And the result, God's people were being destroyed for a lack of knowledge. They didn't know God. They didn't know the Word of God. And there was chaos there in Israel. Well, as I said, today God is going to get a little bit more specific, showing in this case or this lawsuit exactly some of the things that Israel was doing in the name of worship and religion. Now, before we dig into our text, I'm going to have you underline some things. And so I'm going to be able to give you the background of some of the words you're going to underline so that you have a clear understanding of the overall context. Let me draw your attention to today's text. Just go up to verse 15. We read God in his case against the inhabitants of the land. God says, "Though you, Israel," would you underline Israel? "Play the harlot. Do not let," would you please underline, "Judah become guilty." I've explained this to you before, but just so that we're on the same page, at this point when Hosea was writing this letter, again in the 700s BC, the nation of Israel, the once united kingdom of Israel, had already been divided in 931 BC. Now we're down into the 700s. You've got the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom comprised of 10 tribes, the southern kingdom comprised of 2 tribes. The northern kingdom, you underlined the name Israel. The northern kingdom was called Israel, even though the southern kingdom was part of Israel. Nevertheless, the northern kingdom, very often in the scriptures, is referred to Israel. Hop down to verse 17, you see Ephraim. Ephraim was the largest tribe in the northern kingdom. So very often you see in the New Testament the terms Israel and Ephraim used interchangeably to describe the northern kingdom. Back up to verse 15, we also see Judah. That is the southern kingdom. And so here in verse 15, God in his covenant lawsuit talks about Israel playing the harlot, committing spiritual adultery against Yahweh as she was chasing after her lovers, the pagan gods. God says in this lawsuit, though you, Israel, northern kingdom, play the harlot, do not let Judah, southern kingdom, become guilty. But unfortunately, as we're going to see next time, Judah followed the example of what she saw the northern kingdom doing. And she too committed spiritual adultery against Yahweh. So you understand that, right? Israel, Ephraim, terms used interchangeably to describe the northern kingdom, Judah, the southern kingdom. Okay, let's go back up to verse 15. I also want you to underline two places where God says, do not go to Gilgal. Would you underline Gilgal? Or go up to Beth Aven or Aven. Would you underline that as well? Beth, by the way, means house. Aven or Aven means deceit. So God was saying to Judah, southern kingdom, don't become guilty and follow what the northern kingdom's doing. Don't go to Gilgal. I'm going to show you where that place was. Or go up to Beth Aven, house of deceit. You might want to write down another Beth, which we're going to see, Beth El, house of God. You see, Bethel, house of God, was located right next to Beth Aven, house of deceit. And we're going to see why God said, do not go to Beth Aven. Okay? One last thing. Go over to verse 13, where God in his covenant lawsuit describes how they were offering sacrifices on the tops of the mountains. They were burning incense on the hills, also under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Why was that a problem? You're going to see now in a few moments. Okay, I had you underline some things. Let me take you to a couple passages here in the Old Testament. Let me show you and kind of give you the context of some of those places and words, and then we're going to come right back and we're going to be able to make our way through this text, I think, pretty quickly. Okay? So let's start out. Let me introduce you to Bethel. Beth, house, El, of God. Where does that come from? Well, go to Genesis chapter 28. Jacob, whose name would eventually be changed to Israel. He would be the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob, which means deceiver, okay? He had just finished deceiving his brother Esau not once but twice. He also then deceived his father Isaac. Well, when Esau found out what happened, Esau basically wanted to kill his brother Jacob. So Jacob's mother says, you've got to get out of here. go up to Padan Aram, leave Canaan, go to Padan Aram, where mommy was from, and stay there for a while until your brother Esau cools off. Well, we pick up the story, verse 10, that Jacob departed from Beersheba. He left what would become the promised land, and he went to Haran, where his mother had grown up. On his way, verse 11, he came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set. He took one of the stones of the place, put it under his head, and he lay down in that place. No hotels back then, and no comfortable pillows either. And he had a dream. And behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Again, remember the context. Jacob is quickly leaving his family. They were there in Canaan, which again was the promised land. He had to leave because he had deceived his brother twice, and his brother was upset. Well, as he's about to leave Canaan to make his way to Haran, he goes to sleep. And he has a dream. And again, he sees this ladder, heaven open up and a ladder, symbolically telling Jacob, heaven is in full control of what's happening to you, Jacob, on earth. This was to be comfort for Jacob. Again, verse 12, he had a dream. Behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Verse 13, behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am Yahweh, the God of your father Abraham, Jacob's grandfather Abraham, and the God of Isaac, Jacob's father Isaac. The land on which you lie, God promised Jacob, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Now that's interesting. At this point, Jacob wasn't married. He had no children. And God's saying, I'm going to give you this land. Oh, by the way, this land that you're now leaving, I'm going to give you this land to you and to your descendants. Again, this was meant to comfort Jacob because he's about to leave home. Verse 14, your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Same promise God had made to Abraham. Promise that the Messiah was coming through Abraham's line, Isaac's line, Jacob's line. Verse 15, behold, God said, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, Canaan, the promised land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Wow, talk about a dream. Verse 16, Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely Yahweh is in this place. And I didn't know it. He was afraid. He was in awe. And he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the, here it is, house of God. And this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, took the stone that he had put under his head, he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. He worshiped Yahweh, the God of his father Isaac, the God of his grandfather Abraham. And then verse 19, Jacob called the name of that place Bethel, house of God. This place was a religious site in the history of Israel. Those descendants that came after Jacob, those Israelites who were living in the promised land, they knew this story about Jacob and God's promise to him. They knew how that place received its name, Bethel, house of God. Religious site for Israel, right? So that's Bethel. Now let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 12. And again, I'll put this all together when we go to our text in Hosea. But this is so important. Deuteronomy chapter 12. Well, God had promised Jacob, we just read, that he was going to bring Jacob back. Jacob was going to have descendants and so forth. God fulfilled his promise. Fast forward now to Deuteronomy 12. The nation of Israel was about to cross over into the promised land. And here in chapter 12, God is warning the Israelites through Moses that once they crossed into the promised land, they were not to get involved in all those idolatrous worship practices that the pagans were involved in there in the promised land. Verse 1, God says through Moses, "These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land, promised land, which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods." Where are those places? Where do they serve those false gods? We're told, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. The pagans thought that the higher up they could get, they thought the closer they would be able to get to their pagan gods. So therefore, the pagans in the promised land love to have their idolatrous worship services up on the mountains, the hills. They love to be under the shade of trees because, again, they didn't have air conditioning back then, right? And they thought, hey, the higher up we can go, the closer we can get to our gods. And it would be there, they would get drunk. It would be there that they would take mind-numbing drugs. It would be there that they would start having orgies, trying to please or arouse their false gods. It would be there that they would slash themselves, where they would be bleeding, hoping to arouse the pity of their false gods. That's what the pagans did. Up on those mountains and hills and under the shady trees. That's what they did in the promised land. Well, here God warns the Israelites, when I take you into the promised land, you destroy those places. Why? Because God did not want his people to start to drift and get close to and intermingle with those pagans and their pagan worship practices. Do you understand? Verse 2, you shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherim with fire. You shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. Pretty clear, right? You shall not act like this toward Yahweh, doing what the pagans do. But you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling. And there you shall come. That place would eventually be Jerusalem. There, verse 6, you shall bring your burnt offerings, not up on the mountains, but there. Your sacrifices, your tithes, your contribution of your hand, your votive offerings, your freewill offerings, the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. There also you and your households shall eat before the Lord your God, and there you shall rejoice in all your undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. There, not up there on the mountains. You understand? So you understand what Bethel is, house of God. You also understand why the high mountains and hills and shady trees, no, for the Israelites, right? Okay, let's go now to Joshua. You guys are doing well. We're almost finished. We'll get back to our text. Go to Joshua chapter 4. You had also underlined in Hosea, Gilgal. Was that a special place? We know Bethel was, right? What about Gilgal? Well, Joshua 4, starting in verse 19, guess what happened? Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land. Guess where they first stepped foot? In the promised land. Verse 19. The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped where? At Gilgal, on the eastern edge of Jericho. Special place, right? Those 12 stones which they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. He said to the sons of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you shall inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Just like Bethel or Bethel, very special place, religious site, right, for the Israelites. Think of Gilgal as well, right? But there's more with Gilgal. Not only did the Israelites touch their feet there in the promised land in Gilgal, we read in chapter 5. It came about when all the kings of the Amorites, the pagans, who were beyond the Jordan to the west in the promised land, all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, when they heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they crossed, all those pagans, their hearts melted. There was no spirit or breath in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make for yourself flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. Your attention, please. The generation that crossed into the promised land was not the first generation. The first generation was the group that God rescued, delivered out of Egypt, right? They had been circumcised. But we know the first generation, they failed to believe in God and trust in God, and they forfeited the opportunity to enter the promised land. They ended up dying out in the wilderness. But their children, i.e. the second generation, they were the ones whom God led into the promised land. But here's the deal. The second generation was never circumcised. We know circumcision was God's command to the Jews. It's a sign of his covenant. Why wasn't the second generation circumcised? Well, they were in the wilderness. Not very hygienic there, right? So, the second generation now comes into the promised land. right there they camp at Gilgal. And God says to Joshua, circumcise them. We read, verse 3, Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Harlathoth, right there at Gilgal. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, i.e. first generation, who were males, all the men of war, they died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out, they were circumcised. But all the people who were born in the wilderness, second generation, they had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is the men of war, first generation who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Their children, whom God raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised. For they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised along the way. Do you get it? Where did this happen? Verse 8. When they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. By the way, Gilgal means rolling away. So the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. Two big things. Israel first touches down in the promised land where? Gilgal. Second thing, the generation that went into the promised land, they received the sign of the covenant. Circumcision. Where? At Gilgal. Third thing, verse 10, while the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain, and the manna which they ate every day, right? There, as they were wandering in the wilderness, the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. Their feet touched down in Gilgal. They were circumcised at Gilgal. They celebrated the Passover at Gilgal, and it was there that they first ate the beautiful harvest of the promised land, and manna ceased. You think both Bethel and Gilgal were very special places in the history of Israel? Yes. Very special places. Very religious and sacred sites, right? One last thing, chapter 7 here of Joshua. By the way, there was a neighboring town right next to Bethel. Verse 2, Joshua sent men from Jericho after God defeated through the Israelites, people, the city of Jericho. Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which was near what? Beth Aven, house of the seat, which, by the way, was right next to east of Bethel. We like Bethel. Beth Aven? Right? We like house of God, not house of the seat, right? Okay, let's go back to Hosea. You guys have done very well. I needed to give you this background so you really can understand the Lord's case against the inhabitants of the land. Here we go. Verses 1 through 10, God had described various sins of omission and commission that the people, the prophets, and the priests were committing there in the promised land. Now we're going to get really in a lot of details here, where God describes in his lawsuit, he describes exactly how they were committing harlotry against him. Verse 11. Harlotry, wine, and new wine take away their understanding or enslave their hearts. What was the deal with all this alcohol? Where do you think they were getting drunk? At the pagan, idolatrous services. And we know that because look at verse 12. While they're there, my people consult wood. That's what the pagans did. My people consult their wooden idol. Well, where'd they get those wooden idols? Same place they were getting the alcohol to get drunk. My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them. Where'd they get this from? The pagans. And how can we be so certain? God says, for a spirit of harlotry, middle of verse 12, has led them, my people, astray. They've played the harlot, departing from their God. God, what do you mean by that? Verse 13, they offer sacrifices. Well, that's a good thing, right? Nope. Where? On the tops of mountains. And they burn incense. Where? On the hills. Under oak, poplar, terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Didn't we read in Deuteronomy 12 that even before the Israelites got into the promised land, God warned them? Do not go near those places. In fact, destroy all those idols. You know, like pieces of wood, diviner's wands. Do you see the Lord's case against Israel? Where are we going to go worship today? Should we go to some of the religious sites? You know, that our forefathers, where they worship? Nah. Where's the crowd going? Oh, look. They're all going up on the hills. They're all going up on those mountains. Man, look at those trees. It's shady there. Whoa, the alcohol's flowing. They've got their wooden idols there. Their ashram. They got all kinds of things there. Verse 11, harlotry, wine, and new wine take away their understanding. My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them. For a spirit of harlotry has led them astray. They've played the harlot, departing from their God. They offer sacrifices on the tops of the mountains and burn incense on the hills, under oak, poplar, terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters, God said to Israel, the Israelites, play the harlot, and your brides or daughters-in-laws commit adultery. Pooh, at least the men weren't in trouble, right? It's just the women. No. Verse 14, God says, I will not punish your daughters, i.e. alone, when they play the harlot, or I will not punish your brides or daughters-in-laws, i.e. alone, when they commit adultery. Why? For the men themselves go apart with harlots. Where? Up on those hills. And they offer sacrifices with temple prostitutes. So the people without understanding are ruined, destroyed. Oh, the men weren't getting a pass. They were to be the spiritual leaders. They were the ones who were to care for their family and to lead their families towards godliness, not towards spiritual adultery with the pagans. Verse 15. Though you, Israel, northern kingdom, play the harlot, do not let Judah, southern kingdom, become guilty. Judah, don't follow them. Do not go to where? Gilgal. Wait a second. I thought Gilgal was a very special place. We read all about that in Joshua. It was at one time. What do you think it became? Defiled. Where the Israelites were actually worshiping pagan gods at Gilgal. You know Gilgal, where the Israelites first stepped foot into the promised land. You know Gilgal, where the Israelites were circumcised, where they celebrated the Passover and ate the produce of the land, and the manna ceased. At Gilgal, they turned it to, pardon my language, a whorehouse. That's why God said to Judah, don't go to Gilgal. Where else don't go? Don't go up to Beth Aven. Beth Aven, remember, house of the sea, was right next to Bethel, house of God. What do you think happened to Bethel? The influence of Beth Aven on Bethel? Bethel also became a whorehouse. False gods were worshipped there. You know Bethel, the place that Jacob named? Where God had made his promise to Jacob? Do you see what the Israelites did? And by the way, Gilgal and Bethel were located right there, kind of at the border between the southern and northern kingdom. It was in the northern kingdom, but right there at the southern border. That's why God said to Judah, don't go up there. I know you know the history of Gilgal. I know you know the history of Bethel, but Gilgal, it's become a whorehouse. Bethel has become like Beth Aven, house of deceit. Even though they go there, into verse 15, they take the oath as the Lord lives. Oh, they were involved in what's called syncretism. Oh, we're going to worship Yahweh a little bit at this service, but we're also going to worship Baal and Molech and Asherah. We're going to have a smorgasbord of gods. Verse 16, God says, since Israel is stubborn, like a stubborn heifer, obstinate, petulant, didn't want to listen to God's warnings, didn't care about God's lawsuit. Since Israel, northern kingdom, stubborn, like a stubborn heifer. Can the Lord now pasture them like a lamb in a large field? In other words, God's going to leave Israel, the northern kingdom, to be defenseless like a lamb in a large field. Exile was coming. God was going to raise up the Assyrians, and they were going to take out the northern kingdom. Think of what they did to Gilgal. Think of what they did to Bethel. Think of those mountaintops they went up on, those hills under those shady, the shade of the trees. All the wine they were drinking, the drugs they were taking, the orgies they were engaged in. Oh, as the Lord lives, we'll kind of call on Yahweh a little bit. But we also have Baal here. Asherah. Molech. God says about the northern kingdom, she's going to be like a lamb, all by herself, defenseless in a large field. Verse 17, why? Ephraim, i.e. the northern kingdom, is joined to idols. Let him alone. God's wrath of abandonment. Let them alone. Their liquor gone. They play the harlot continually. Their rulers dearly love shame. And God says in verse 19, the wind, his whirlwind of wrath, is going to wrap them up. And he's going to toss them out of the promised land. They were going to be taken into exile by the Assyrians. And then they will be ashamed because of their sacrifices to those false gods. Whoa. You see why I wanted to spend some time showing you Bethel, Deuteronomy 12, about the God's warning about the hills and the mountains and the shady areas under the trees. You see why I wanted to talk to you about Gilgal and also show you Beth Aven, how it was right next to Bethel? Do you see what was happening? And again, Judah, we'll see next time. Yeah, Judah, she didn't learn the lesson. She too would fall into the trap of spiritual harlotry. And eventually she too would be taken into exile by the Babylonians. You see why the Lord had a case against the inhabitants of the land? And guys, you've got to understand this point here. At this time, when Hosea was writing this, as Hosea was acting as God's prosecuting attorney, representing Yahweh in his case against Israel, do you realize that Israel was enjoying material prosperity? As we would say today, the market was exploding. The economy was just rolling along. So they were experiencing material prosperity, and they were involved in all kinds of religiosity. Oh, they worshipped. Oh, yes. They attended worship services every week. In fact, numerous times during the week. But where? And who were they worshiping? Do you see it? And they became like stubborn, stiff-necked heifers. God sends his prophets as his prosecuting attorneys, and the people don't want to listen. No. We're going to go to the popular places. We're going to go to the cool, the church of what's happening now. We're going to go where all the people are going. It's got the best parking. It's got the most comfortable seating. Look at all that they offer there. You've got the Cappuccino Cafe bar there. You've got video games there. You've got movie theater type seating and screens there. It's the coolest place. And everyone's going there. Do you see how nothing is new under the sun, gang? What Israel was doing back then in the name of worship, think about what's happening here in the United States in the name of worship. And think about how they're turning the Lord's church into Beth Aven, houses of deceit. No longer Bethel, house of God. It's Beth Aven. Again, middle verse 12, what God said about Israel. Same thing today. A spirit of harlotry has led them astray. They've played the harlot, departing from their God. But wait a second, God, we're worshiping, we're going to all kinds of worship services. We've got our sacrifices, we've got our incense. God says, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. They weren't worshiping Yahweh. And boy, think about today. What is the criteria that the people use to decide which church to go to? How big's the building? How comfortable is the seating? Parking lot? Cappuccino Cafe? What kind of activities do they have to entertain my children and myself? Is it the popular place? Is it the church of what's happening now in our city? Is the pastor a megastar? How cool's the band? How much entertainment do they give me? And churchgoers today are being destroyed for a lack of knowledge. They don't know who the true living God is. Because the Word of God is hidden. And entertainment becomes king. And the people up on the stage, as they call it, entertain the customers who come in. And they'll pay for the show. As long as the people up there don't talk about sin, don't talk about wrath, don't talk about damnation. As long as the sermons are short, as long as the sermons are witty, as long as the sermons are funny and feel-good, ear-tickling sermons. Where do you want to go to church today? Let's go up on that hill. That's where everybody's going. Oh, we can mention Jesus, but we got a smorgasbord of other things that we can worship. You know what they were doing in Israel? They were making up their own religion. They had their own priesthood. They had their own religious holidays. They were doing things their own way, not God's way. In fact, let's just go to 1 Kings, and I'll conclude here. Chapter 12. The first king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam the first. Let's read about him. 1 Kings chapter 12, starting in verse 25. After the United Kingdom was split in two, again, you had the northern kingdom, 10 tribes. Jeroboam was the first king, Jeroboam the first. You had the southern kingdom, 2 tribes. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, was the king there. Well, let's see what happened with Jeroboam in the northern kingdom. Verse 25. Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, again, northern kingdom, and he lived there. Okay, so far so good. He went out from there, he built Penuel. Okay, so far so good. But then verse 26. Jeroboam said in his heart, whoa. Now the kingdom's going to return to the house of David. The people up here in the northern kingdom, I'm king over them. They're going to end up drifting back down and settling in the south. Why? What was down there in Jerusalem? The temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices. Right? So Jeroboam goes, man, I'm going to lose my kingdom. What do I do? Verse 27, he said, if the people go to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord, Jerusalem, the temple, if they go to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah. They're going to kill me and return to Rehoboam. So what does Jeroboam do? He became a people pleaser. Verse 28. He made 2 golden calves. And he said, you know what, to the northern kingdom, it's too much for you to go down to Jerusalem. Behold, northern kingdom, here are your gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt. He set up his own religion. He set up his own gods. And where did he set it up at? Verse 21, one of them in Bethel. Whoa. Right there, southern border of the northern kingdom. Another one in Dan, northernmost part of the northern kingdom, so that the people could worship all they wanted and stay right there in the north. You live close to Dan, you can go up there and worship the golden calf. You're a little south, close to Bethel, you can just come right here. Just don't cross the border and go to Jerusalem. What? Verse 30, this thing became a sin. Do you think? For the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. They're worshiping golden calves. Not only that, verse 31, Jeroboam, he made houses. Houses of worship where? On the high places. Right where the pagans were. But of course, let's just do what the pagans are doing. Seems to work. People are going there. They're having fun there. It's the cool place to go. Let's go. Let's build our own up there. He made houses on high places, made priests from among all the people who were not the sons of Levi. Right? It's through the tribe of Levi that the priests came. Jeroboam goes, no. Well, they're down there in the south. No, I'm just going to anoint you, appoint you. You can be a priest. You can lead worship up there. And Dan down here in Bethel, we got our high places. He was just ordaining guys left and right. But they weren't from the tribe of Levi, going completely against God's commands, right? What else did he do? Verse 32, Jeroboam instituted a feast. He set up his own religious holidays. On the 8th month of the 15th of the month, like the feast which is in Judah, he went up to the altar. Thus he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves which he had made. There, Judah, God had set up a feast of booths, 7th month, the year. Well, Jeroboam goes, we don't want to. We're going to set up this on the 8th. You guys don't have to go down there. You can just worship up here. Again, he instituted a feast on the 8th month of the 15th day of the month. Like the feast which is in Judah, which was the 7th month on the 15th. He went up to the altar. He did this in Bethel. How about that one? Sacrificing in Bethel to the calves which he had made. And he stationed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. Then he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised in his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the sons of Israel and went up to the altar to burn incense. That was the first king of the northern kingdom. That was in 931 BC. Fast forward now to the 700s during the time of Hosea. And do you see why the Lord had a case against the inhabitants of the land? As I conclude, let me ask all of you a question. What is your criteria for the church that you attend? Are they preaching the Word of God? Is that your first criteria? And thus worshiping and revering God according to His Word? Or are you just looking for the church of what's happening now? The most popular place where the crowd's going. Think of what Israel did. And how'd that work out for them? God's whirlwind was going to wrap them up and take them into exile. And it did happen. Both northern and southern tribes. Are you looking for a church? Are you part of a church where you have the proper preaching of the Word? The proper administration of the sacraments? The proper administration of church discipline to maintain the purity, unity, and doctrinal integrity of the church? Or are you looking for a church that is a free-for-all? Up on the mountains and hills. Do you realize how many churches today are doing church just like Jeroboam did it back then? They're doing it their own way. They're not following God's prescribed commands about how he desires and demands to be worshipped. Just do it their own way to keep the people coming, to make sure the people are not leaving, just like Jeroboam. They will compromise, they will acquiesce, they'll do whatever it takes to keep the crowd coming. My friend, don't get swept up in that. Because you don't want to get swept up in God's whirlwind of wrath. The church is not your church. The church is not my church. The church is not the church of the pastor, the elders. It is the Lord Jesus Christ. It's his church. He's the head of the church. And he commands us how he wants his church to function. And his word describes that clearly. And for anybody to deviate from that or to demand the church leaders to deviate from that, my friend, you're no different than Jeroboam, and you're no different than the inhabitants of the land which the Lord had a case against. Think about where you're attending church right now. Think about what is happening while you're attending church. And then think about what the Lord has to say about what he's seeing as people worship him in the way they desire and not in the way that he desires. Spend some time now in silent prayer. Ask yourself some challenging questions. Where are you worshiping, and how are you worshiping?